Hi, theater classes. Sorry to abandon you again, but gotta do what you gotta do to adult, huh? So we're gonna walk through this PowerPoint. So on Schoology, go ahead and click on the theater history PowerPoint. I'm gonna review, and then we'll go over to the Greek one later. But for right now, start with the theater history PowerPoint. What's going to be nice about this is to take time to write and to take notes. All you have to do is pause. So if you were not here on, I believe it was Friday of last week, my days are all jumbled up. But if you were not here Friday of last week, you'll need to get the notes off somebody. I am going to do a quick review, but I don't think it'll be enough. But honestly, you can look at the PowerPoint if you missed Friday, and I'm going to kind of go through that. Just remember, I'm going to go ahead and start now with the PowerPoint, that theater started off as a way to teach the Bible, and these theater companies would go through towns and teach books of the Bible and different religious aspects. Sorry, my cat is distracting me. Teach different religious aspects through what we call pageant wagons that would go around the towns, and they would do what we call mystery plays, which was religious drama. Now, eventually we moved away from religious drama. Remember, religious is summed up by the word sacred. And then eventually we moved away from that and got to what we call secular, which is non-religious. And that was a big part of the Reformation. So, the court of Henry VIII was really noted as kind of helping us get away from religion. And he used theater as a way to impress different people who would come and visit. We talked about how that also created the need for different types of drama that was outside of religion. So that's kind of where we are with that. So because we were getting away from religion, we had to move theater outside of the walls of the city and outside of their jurisdiction, because the city still had control and they were heavily predominated by the Catholic Church. So we had to get away from London particularly. So in the 1570s we saw playhouses being built, and the first playhouse was called The Theater in 1576. And it was built in Finsbury Fields. So you need to know that that's where the first theater was built, was in Finsbury Fields in 1576, and it was called The Theater. Oh, yeah. Now, try to recall on your own what became a hub for theater, what place, other than Finsbury Fields. We had another place that had a lot of theaters develop, and that was South Bank. The South Bank became a really popular place for theaters to pop up just because it was outside of the of London's jurisdiction for religion. So as we go through, we started employing new writers because we could now write for things outside of the Bible. So now we don't have the Bible as your script. You actually have to make up new material about the divide between the different classes as we start accepting the middle class and even eventually the lower class into watching theater productions. We talked about how theater companies became hierarchical, with the sharers each contributing to help put on plays, and then eventually at the end would help split the profit. Then you have hirelings, which were paid weekly wages, and they were kind of like the main people that you would call on during a play. And then you have the apprentices, which were people who were paid very little and honestly paid in experience, in the hopes that as these boys would progress through their youth, they would eventually take on roles to play young men and then eventually become the hero as they become older and well-versed with acting, remembering that women were not allowed to participate in that time. So we're in the 1500s, and even women are still not allowed to do theater. So we talked about a guy. This is my cat, Annie. Everyone meet Annie. Annie, say hi. Say hi. I'm just wanting to interrupt, Dad. All right, good night. We talked about a guy named Richard Burbage. He was Shakespeare's leading man. Remember, Shakespeare's company was called the Chamberlain's Men, or also the King's Men. So we have this guy, Richard Burbage, who was the leading dude, and he was the first guy to play Hamlet. He was King Lear, Othello, all of that stuff. So he was kind of like, he was kind of top notch, if you will. So he was pretty cool. So if you move on to the next slide, this is where we left off on Friday, and we're picking back up today. I'm trying not to die, and it's not working. Sorry. All right, so then we have on the slide, King James I and later his son Charles I commissioned private performances called masques, which involved music, dance, and extravagant costumes and extraordinary scenery and special effects. Essentially, that is a masquerade. So again, we have royalty kind of putting on something along the lines of dance, something along the lines of music, but now we started focusing more on how they acted while they were there, and also hiring people to help keep the atmosphere unique. So we see people start to integrate theater into their daily life if they're rich. So theater was really an expression of wealth in this time period as well. If you look at the next slide, you can see what costumes would have been like at these masks, these masquerades. And then you can also see scenery that they would have put into a large room. So that's kind of what is here. I'm really digging that. I'm hoping to see some prom dresses like that next year. So if you're collecting huge wooden spoons, please put them on your prom dress. Okay, dudes, where does a tie? I don't care. All right, Inigo Jones. I always think of this guy as Indiana Jones. He introduced the proscenium arch. And we talked a long time ago in theater about how the proscenium arch is kind of what we look through whenever we watch a play. It's that brick arch that we have in the auditorium. But here, he introduced the proscenium arch, and it was able to hide scenery. So he had a series of shutters. So imagine like the wall that's between Mr. Nayer's room and I think it's the old health room, like an accordion-style wall. He introduced these kind of things that would go around in grooves in the floor to be the scenery, and that's how it moved. So Inigo Jones was really credited for scenery in the time. Excuse me. Now remember, they didn't have electricity, so they had to use candles to light the stage, and he's like, hey, let's not just use candles, let's make them colored glass behind them so we can change it. So he was kind of like the pioneer of all things special effects, which is kind of basic, but at the time it wasn't. So change the slide to the Civil War. In 1642, civil war broke out in England, and theaters were closed to prevent public disorder. It became so hostile there that they really could not go anywhere or trust anyone to do anything without fights breaking out. So they just said, we cannot even go out in public. You cannot go out to buy a tomato without getting in a fight with your neighbor. So that really put a halt to theater as a whole in this middle 1600s. So for 18 years, theaters were closed. And that really put a halt on all the progress that they had made after the Reformation. So knowing the year 1642 is pretty important in knowing that that was Civil War time and it lasted for 18 years. So if you do the math, 1660 is when that would have stopped, excuse me. So we have the Reformation, we have Civil War, then following we have Restoration, which is as we come out of the Civil War, what came from it. So we have all of this excitement in kind of knowing we're getting back to those times. So we have the semi-operas that rose out of that. And they were adaptations of other plays, and it says often Shakespeare. These had episodes of music, singing, dancing, and special effects. So imagine theater was bottled up for 18 years, and then whenever we were finally able to open it back up, we said it's not just acting. It's everything artistic became part of it. So that's whenever we start to see operas really form. Now, they didn't take on their full state of being 4 hours long, but it was small episodes that later eventually kind of grew into opera. So take a look at the next one. In 1674, the production of The Tempest had many spectacular scenes, including a storm. Think pre-electricity. How do you make a storm on stage? So it was really groundbreaking to write that for a script. The Tempest, of course, actually translates or is a synonym for the word storm. So it impacted the design of theater buildings because we wanted to keep all of these wonderful things we saw with special effects. So we started to put more things in our buildings that we could hide things backstage. So again, that's where the proscenium arch came into play because you could hide things behind the walls of the arch. So Charles II, move on to that slide. The introduction of women on stage. Women power. Hallelujah. What's the thing? We can do it. Got Rosie the Riveter. I'll move on. So, women were finally introduced on the stage thanks to Charles II. The introduction of movable perspective scenery, like what we saw with Inigo Jones, it influenced how the buildings were even made. He licensed 2 venues for performances. That was at Lincoln Inn Fields and Drury Lane. Drury Lane, sound familiar? Do you know the Muffin Man? Right, Drury Lane. Okay, so you do need to know that those 2 theaters were commissioned by Charles II. So they became patent theaters. So whenever someone makes a patent on something, it kind of stops other people from producing it as well. And Charles II was kind of a leader in that. He permitted only certain things, and it says here tragedies, comedies, plays, opera, musical theater, and dancing is what Charles II was all about. So now that we've introduced women to the stage, we have some important people to look. Elizabeth Barry, who is known as the Queen of Tragedy. She was trained for the stage by notorious womanizer, the Earl of Rochester, who was her lover. So you need to know Elizabeth Barry was the Queen of Tragedy, and she was kind of like infatuated with and in a connected relationship, shall we say, with the Earl of Rochester. So make sure you get that down. The most infamous actress, though, the one that, like, whenever we look back at that time period, who stands out the most was Nell Gwynn. So if we back up a slide, Charles II, he finds this girl, Nell Gwynn, and they have 2 children together. So we can kind of see that this guy who owned the theater, probably who owned those 2 theaters, probably influenced her ability to act. So those were 2 powerhouses coming out for women being introduced to theater. So in the 18th century, we're talking 1700s, they saw the flourishing of theater as a popular pastime. What baseball was for America at one point, and probably what football is now, was theater at one point in Europe. When built by Christopher Wren in 1674, Drury Lane had held less than 1,000 people, but it was later expanded to hold 3,000. So you can see the growth in theater from the time that it was built in 1674 to 1794. So playhouses were constructed across London and also opened up in the provinces. Excuse me. That's probably obnoxious if you're wearing headphones. R.I.P. headphone users. So the Beggar's Opera. You do need to know that it was one of the most successful shows on the London stage in the early 1700s. It was a ballad opera, and it was written by John Gay. He recycled popular songs of the day and kind of incorporated in new lyrics that were humorous and satirical. So it was kind of like, I'm blanking out on the word. Like a remake, but it's making fun, a parody. So this guy, John Gay, wrote parodies of things that were in existence, and everyone absolutely loved it. So that's what we see with the Beggar's Opera. I know I'm moving quick, but what's nice is you can pause, rewind, go back, do it again. All right, so David Garrick. It's really important because when we think of Hollywood, we have all those stars on the walk. When we think of a dressing room, we see the stars with their name on the dressing room. We get that from this guy, David Garrick. He was the first one to be called a star. He changed the whole style of acting. He rejected the fashion for declamation, which means like someone would come in and go, the enemy approacheth. He said, no, that's not acting. We need to make it more like real life. So he preferred a more easy, natural manner of speech and movement. So pretty much a move toward realism. We talked about how everything was over-dramatized for effect and drama. But now he made it more real. So David Garrick is really where we start to see what we consider like TV acting now. So we're coming in close, so hold on. I know this is probably not fun at all, but the Licensing Act of 1737. The act restricted the production of plays to the 2 patent theaters and tightened up the censorship of drama, stating that the Lord Chamberlain, with his examiners of plays, must vet any script before a performance was allowed. With all the satire going on, we actually see leadership positions, King Charles, saying, hey, you are not allowed to produce any new plays until we screen them. We only trust this company to screen the plays that are coming in because you're starting to get too political. It's kind of like, never mind, I'm going to get too political getting into it. But it's essentially leadership saying, you're being offensive to me, you can't do that. So we actually have people licensing plays saying you are not allowed to put it on until you have a license to do so. And we have those 2 theaters that we talked about earlier doing it from Charles II. So the act was put into place by Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who was concerned that political satire on the stage was undermining him and the authority of the government. So we have this Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. He's putting all of this stuff into state, and again, leaving those 2 theaters by Charles II to be performing them. And of course, it does say that, stating that the Lord Chamberlain, with his examiners of plays, must vet any of the script. So remembering that that is Shakespeare's company. So that could be why we see a whole lot of Shakespeare going through, is because he was the one who was licensing these plays. In 1843, the Patent Act was dropped, enabling other theaters to present drama. However, the Lord Chamberlain's censorship of plays remained in place until 1968. One of the last plays to be censored was Edward Bond's production of Saved in 1965. So we see a whole lot of people being constricted because there was censorship, entirely trying to avoid some topics and everything. And we're talking even into the 1900s. So, all right. So take a second now to pause this and move on to the Greek theater one. I'm chewing gum, drinking coffee and water. I'm living the dream over here. Oh, Annie has come for a visit. You get nasty. Get off. All right. So, take a look now at the Greek theater. What's going to help here is to make a list of vocabulary words as we go through. Annie, get away from that. So, ancient Greek theater flourished in the 5th and 4th centuries. Please remember, if it's BC, we work 5th, 4th, 2nd, 3rd, and then we progress. So just remember, that's why it's like that. During this time, Greek was defeating the Persians. Cool stuff. So Athens became a center of Greek power and culture, kind of like a capital city. So think of West Virginia and Charleston. How Charleston has a whole lot going on and is where we formed our capital. However, other cities now are growing larger. So I'm thinking of Morgantown, Huntington, and even Beckley area is growing. So we have these centers of powers, not necessarily capital. But that's important because that tells where different theaters are going to pop up. And how theater will be influenced way earlier in a different region than what we were just talking about with the last PowerPoint. So Athens became a center of Greek power and culture. This period was known as Classical Greece. Much of the West, and that means our culture, much of our culture, whether it's thinking, politics, and philosophy, comes from this society. I can't talk. It's really awkward just being here talking to myself. Greek drama was performed in village festivals. Sound familiar? It soon moved to Athens and became a major annual event and competition. Dramatists were asked to submit 4 plays. You need to know 4 plays, 3 tragedies, and 1 comedy. The plays would be performed over 3 days, and a prize would be given on the 3rd day for the winner. It was one of the greatest honors an Athenian could receive. So, like, think of the Nobel Peace Prize, Pulitzer Prize. Pretty much what those are to us would have been writing one of these plays and winning at this festival that they held in Athens. So let's talk about the staging. Greek theaters were always outdoors. The stage consisted of an orchestra for the chorus. That was kind of like a carved out place, not so much like sunken in below the stage like we would think for an orchestra pit. So an orchestra was like an area, kind of like an arched area for people to talk. And we'll talk about what the chorus means. A skene. And you actually pronounce S-K-E-N-E. Skene. So, that was introduced. And it was a backdrop wall that stood right behind the stage. And you'll see pictures of that later on. This is probably really distracting for you. Annie, stop. I'm looking at a mirror image. Ow. She literally just bit me. The whole. Anyway, so this skene later became a whole building, and it's where this proscenium arch is introduced. And then we saw in the other PowerPoint how we have Inigo Jones modifying this proscenium arch to be to be something more complex, but kind of serve a similar purpose. And you'll see where the difference is. So this is the earlier version, and then Inigo Jones really kind of perfected it and moved it into its current state. Theaters were carefully constructed to maximize acoustics. We're going to see that performing in such a large space outdoors was tough on getting everything heard. Take a look at the next slide. We have the skene, which is that building in the back, and look how many seats that is. That is a huge area that holds thousands of people. So acting was way different than what it is now, and the orchestra held a chorus, which is a group of people that would speak at the same time. They were the narrators. And because they would speak at the same time, it would project so everyone could hear it, and they would speak very loud. So that's what a chorus was. It wasn't people, it was not like a group of people that sang. It was a bunch of people that talked at the same time so that the story could be heard. So that's kind of where we're at with that. We're going to talk a little bit more about each section of this theater here in a moment. So look at the next slide. You can see this building, the skene in the background. There's no proscenium arch within this. But I want you to take a look in the very middle of what we have, like that flat area. That is what we consider the stage, but that is the orchestra. And in the middle of it, we're going to talk about what's unique about that later, but take note. So if you look at the next one, you can see the proscenium arch later on as we start building marble constructs, and as we go farther into time, you can see the proscenium arch in that 7th slide. So take a look. The orchestra, I'm on the next slide now. So we have a diagram. It's like kind of like a sketch looking at from bird's eye view. A building, part of a building, or an outdoor area for housing dramatic presentations, stage entertainment, or motion picture shows, is talking about this whole area. Orchestra, the circular space in front of the stage, reserved for the chorus. The chorus is a group of actors that I already talked about. The skene is a structure facing the audience, forming the background. So it's pretty much like old scenery. Proscenium, the front of the stage where the actors performed. So it's kind of like the front area and then bleeding into the orchestra. Parados. I remember parados like paradors. It's the entrances and exits at the side of the skene. Parados, paradors. Write that down. Parados, paradors. Okay, now the parascenium. Parascenium. That's like proscenium, para meaning multiple. It's the two wings flanking and projecting forward from the skene of an ancient Greek theater containing apartments for the actors. So these are kind of like dorms. And if you think about like the hirelings and the apprentices in European theater, we see that here in way earlier times where we housed them. Places where they could stay after rehearsals. So that's what the parascenium is. It's attached to the proscenium. Remember, para apartments. Para apartments. So, diazoma. Diazoma and cerces are two terms that you really need to kind of write down, jot down the meaning. So a diazoma is an aisle between the lower and upper tiers. So you can kind of see like two rainbow arches. So the diazoma is the aisle between an upper and lower level. And cerces are the wedge shapes of seats. So think about our auditorium. We have three clumps of seats. You have the cerces that go down. Our auditorium doesn't have a diazoma that splits our seating into upper and lower. It's not balcony and like main floor. We're just talking a place that has a walkway in between. So if you've ever been in the Charleston Civic Center, they have different levels, and that would be like the diazoma. So make sure you know what diazoma and cerces are. All right, originally, plays were just a chorus, a group of 50 speakers who recited a story at the same time, meaning in verse. Traditional drama really began when an actor named Thespis had the idea for one person to break away from the chorus and reply to what was said. So maybe the chorus would all say, "And here comes a stranger." And then someone would step out and go, "He's from that other town over." So we had this idea to, hey, let's make it a whole conversation instead of just telling a story. So this guy named Thespis. And if you know anything about theater going in, people who are involved in theater currently are called thespians. They're thespians. And that's where we get this name, from this guy named Thespis. Sorry. Ooh. Random story time. So I made these coaster things. I bought old tiles from the Restore in Charleston. Like they're like bathroom tiles. And I bought scrapbook paper and I Mod Podged it on there. I made really cool coasters. And I put furniture pads on the bottom. Like, this is so nice. If you ever want to really cheap, like if you want to be cheap, just buy a bunch of paper for 35 cents it looks nice, but it's 35 cents at a cheap craft store. You buy a $1.50 tile and you have a gift. And it looks like you put some thought into it. But really, you procrastinated the whole month of December. So in Greek theater, the chorus shrank from 50 down to 15 because we had all of these people who would speak. So now we had to have a way of discriminating between the different characters when chorus members would speak. And also we had a problem with volume. So we'll get to how we fix that. The chorus would narrate the drama and commentate on what's happening. They would ask questions that the audience might be thinking. Who is that approacheth? So they would ask questions so that someone else in the chorus could answer it. So that's how they really made dialogue happen in a simple form. So 3 actors would be on stage performing numerous roles. They would change like a color of a robe or their mask. So we're going to get to the masks and costumes. So go ahead and change the slide. The masks were made out of things like wood, linen, leather, or cork. Human or animal hair would make wigs. And the mouth would be way wide. And it was the hope that that mask would magnify the volume so that they could be heard. So these faces were designed to show age, gender, and emotion. So we could discriminate between them. So if there was one character who was evil, that same mask would be used throughout the whole time. Even if they were trying, like this evil character was trying to act nice or lure somebody in. So, Annie, stop scratching. Thank you. So, you can see a picture of what some of the masks would have looked like, and even modern day masks. We still use those masks all the time to represent theater. So, the costumes help the actors change roles really quick. So they did like purple for royalty, trailing robes, tattered ones for grief. So honestly, like a hat could have even been worn. So that's how they made these characters so different from far away, was colors, shape of robes, different things that they would wear. Annie, stop scratching. I'm so sorry. So sorry. The chorus. It's one of the most famous things. When we think about Greek theater, we think of the chorus right off bat. Honestly, I think of the masks first, but some people say the chorus is kind of what lingers in our thought. We talked about how they would represent a group of people within the context of the play, like the elders in a community. So they just were kind of like big groups. Their function was to be heard, not really part of any drama. So they did not make motion or anything like that. They would stay in the circle area. So I'm on slide 16. It kind of just summarizes everything. Let's look at Sophocles. Sophocles was one of the most famous Greek playwrights. He regularly won those competitions at Athens. He wrote very famous tragedy called King Oedipus, or Oedipus Rex. It is hilarious. So we have Laius and Jocasta, who are king and queen of Thebes, and this oracle comes and tells them that if they have a child, that child is going to kill the father, the king, but then end up marrying his mother. So when Jocasta gives birth to the child, they're like, oh no, we can't make this thing happen. So then they send this, like they pin this child's ankles together and then send him away to a mountainside. They get rid of their child. They pretty much like put him in a dumpster. So they're like, oh, don't have to worry about that coming true. So then a shepherd finds him and is like, oh, poor kid. So then there's this other queen and king in Corinth, far away. The shepherd's like, oh, poor baby, let me give you to the king and queen that can't have any kids. So this kid becomes a prince of Corinth. So then later on, we have that son whose legs were pinned, was given to another king and queen. Again, his name is Oedipus. So Oedipus grew up not knowing his real mother and father, had kind of a rough childhood with his legs pinned together. He finds out that he's adopted by the king and queen of Corinth. And then he is visited by the same oracle who made that original prophecy. And he tells him the prophecy, but not who his real parents are. So he doesn't want this thing to come true either. So he's like, I'm going to leave Corinth. I feel like I'm in danger. Got to leave. So I think you all can see where this is going. So he's traveling. He encounters a chariot, and he finds the driver and kills him in order to take the chariot. So we kind of later find out that that chariot driver is his real father. So obviously step one of the oracle prophecy is complete. He has killed his biological father, not knowing it. So when he arrives at Thebes, a sphinx stops him and asks him a riddle, and Oedipus gets this riddle right. The sphinx is astounded and throws himself off a cliff. The people of Thebes are like, you're wonderful, I can't believe you got rid of this riddler. It's amazing, great job, Oedipus, hooray. And they appoint him king and give him Jocasta's hand in marriage. Remember who Jocasta is? It's Oedipus's biological mother. So the oracle is complete. Together they have 4 children. So Oedipus has 4 children with his own mother. Okay, Greek theater is crazy. Crazy. Now, if you were to watch it, it would be the most boring thing for you because it's not written in our language. And honestly, the adaptations are so like antiquated, so old. But honestly, if they were to make a modern day version of Greek theater, it would be epic, I promise you. So really, guys, you should really look into this stuff. It's pretty cool. But a plague strikes anyway in this Greek tragedy, and and thanks to another prophet, Oedipus's true identity is revealed. So Oedipus is horrified that he killed his own father, married his own mother, and Oedipus discovered that Jocasta has killed herself. His mother has killed herself. He takes the 2 pins from her dress, gouges his eyes out. Greek theater, everybody. Awesome. He eventually dies in Colonus, and his sons, blah, 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 take over the kingdom, and they fight over their reign, and they kill each other. Jocasta's brother takes the crown and refuses to give burial rites to Oedipus's family. His sister Antigone tries to bury him, but she is buried alive in a rock cavern as punishment for defying the king's orders. Yeah, so that is Greek tragedy. You can see why there's tragedy. So honestly, that's the end of that PowerPoint, not the end of Greek theater of what we're going to talk about. But I do want you all to make sure you have notes for anything we talked about today, even the story of Oedipus, using the slide to kind of reinforce what we talked about. And we're going to talk about I told you to remember that middle section of Greek theater in the orchestra. We're going to take a look at what that is, but it's an altar for Dionysus, I believe is how you say it, or Dionysus or something. So we're going to take a look at that altar. So I'm going to post some more stuff to Schoology for Tuesday for you all to look at, and it's like vocab and stuff. So I know this bleeds into Tuesday, but if you've got extra time on Tuesday, take a look at that, because it's the altar for the god of theater, who is also like the god of wine and fertility. So this stuff gets pretty messed up pretty quick. But we are going to have a test on Greek theater, like the actual theater itself, its elements. So make sure you dive through Schoology and look at all that stuff. But hope you, I hope you all are doing good. I'm trying to get everything settled in here in Huntington. I know I've kind of been abandoning you all, but really miss you all, and I'll be back on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So really try your best to make the best of this. So. All right, we'll talk to you all later. It's not stopping, I don't think. All right. Oh!